Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the darkest, most unsettling corners of American history. A time when people genuinely believed they might wake up 6 feet underground, clawing at wooden boards while dirt rained down on their coffins. Picture it. The year is somewhere between 1850 and 1890. Gas lamps flicker in Victorian parlours, and a family gathers around a deathbed. The doctor checks for a pulse. Nothing. He holds a mirror to the lips. No fog. He declares the patient gone, and within hours the body's washed, dressed in funeral blacks and sealed inside a wooden box. But here's the thing that kept people awake at night, and I mean genuinely terrified, not just mildly spooked. What if the doctor was wrong? What if your mother, your child, your spouse was still in there, conscious but completely paralysed, unable to scream or move as the lid was nailed shut? This fear wasn't some fringe paranoia cooked up by Gothic novelists, though they certainly had a field day with it. Real doctors published papers about it. Newspapers ran sensational headlines about it. Families spent enormous sums of money installing bells and tubes in coffins specifically to prevent it. Entrepreneurs built entire businesses around it. And across America, in cities and small towns alike, people genuinely, deeply worried that premature burial wasn't just possible, it was probable. You probably won't survive this episode without double-checking that your own pulse is still going afterward. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are right now. I love knowing where my listeners are settling in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The 1800s were a strange time to be sick or dying in America. Medicine was caught in this bizarre liminal space. Not quite medieval, but nowhere near modern either. Doctors had recently discovered germ theory, which was exciting, but they were still using leeches and bloodletting with alarming frequency. They had stethoscopes now, which was great, but no real way to measure brain activity or consciousness. Death, you see, was supposed to be obvious. Your heart stops. You stop breathing, and you're gone. Except sometimes the heart didn't stop right away. Sometimes breathing seemed to pause for hours. Sometimes a person looked dead, felt dead, seemed dead in every way, but wasn't. The historical record is thick with accounts of people being buried alive. Some of these accounts are almost certainly exaggerated or entirely fabricated, the product of grief-addled minds or sensationalist newspaper editors who understood that horror sells papers. But others had enough corroborating detail that even skeptical doctors had to pause and wonder. A quirky fact that circulated in medical circles. Some undertakers reported finding scratch marks on the inside of coffin lids, particularly around the corners and seams where a desperate person might claw at wood. Whether these marks were actually from living victims or simply the result of decomposition and settling bones remains hotly debated, but the image haunted the Victorian imagination. Historians still argue whether the actual incidence of premature burial in 1800s America was truly as common as people believed, or whether fear of it vastly outpaced the reality. What's not debatable is that the fear was real, urgent and epidemic in its own way. It infected the minds of the living with a particular kind of dread that was uniquely suited to the era. One part medical uncertainty, one part Victorian melodrama, and one part very rational anxiety about the limits of human knowledge. You're lying there now, warm and comfortable, but as you listen, imagine being the family doctor in 1854. A patient comes to you with a high fever, sweating, delirious. You bleed them to balance the humours, you apply poultices, you wait. The fever breaks, the patient goes still, very still. You check for signs of life using the methods available to you, and there are precious few. A mirror held to the nose, a hand pressed to the chest. Maybe you listen with your stethoscope to the silence where a heartbeat should be, and you declare the person dead. You sign the death certificate, you walk away. But what if you were wrong? What if, in that moment, your patient was simply in a state so deep, so profound, that it mimicked death perfectly? What if consciousness was still flickering somewhere in the darkness of the brain, aware but absolutely unable to signal? This was the nightmare that gripped America in the 19th century, and it was about to get much, much worse. Death wasn't always certain, and that's a truth the 1800s hammered home with ruthless consistency. You have to understand that by modern standards, The diagnostic toolkit available to 19th century American doctors was almost comically limited. You're accustomed to EKGs, brain scans, blood tests that can tell you the moment oxygen stops flowing to cells. A 19th century physician had a mirror, a hand, maybe a stethoscope if they were well equipped, and their own sense of observation. The definition of death itself was slippery. Was it the moment the heart stopped? The moment the brain ceased function? The moment rigor mortis set in? Different doctors offered different answers, and that ambiguity was fertile ground for catastrophe. Consider the practical reality of a deathbed in 1855. Medicine had no way to measure brain function. There was no encephalogram, no way to know whether consciousness persisted when the body seemed to shut down. A doctor might check for a pulse and find none. They might hold a mirror to the patient's mouth and see no condensation. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as the saying goes. The body might simply be in a state of profound shock, a kind of hibernation from which it could theoretically awaken. Except that by the time anyone realised the person wasn't actually dead, they'd already be in the ground. The medical literature of the era bristles with case studies of people who seemed dead but weren't. A woman in Boston, supposedly dead from cholera for 3 days, reportedly began breathing again as she was being prepared for burial, though accounts vary wildly about what exactly happened next. A man in Philadelphia was said to have revived on his way to the cemetery. A child in New York woke up during the funeral service itself. Some of these accounts are documented in contemporary newspapers and medical journals. Others exist only in family lore, passed down through generations with the kind of embellishment that makes it hard to separate fact from fiction. But the fact that they were taken seriously at all speaks volumes about how uncertain death seemed. Here's a quirky detail that most people don't know. Some American towns in the 1800s actually hired watchers, whose job was to sit with the dead for a full day or even 2 before burial, just in case the person showed signs of revival. These watchers were supposed to be alert for any movement, any change in body temperature, any indication that consciousness might still be present. In some cases, they were instructed to perform painful stimuli on the body, pinching, pricking with pins, even applying heat, to see if the supposedly dead person would react. It sounds barbaric by modern standards, but it was born from genuine medical uncertainty and the very rational fear that getting it wrong would mean condemning a living person to suffocation in a sealed box. The challenge was that medical science in this era was just starting to understand what actually happens when the body shuts down. Rigor mortis, that stiffening of the muscles that occurs after death, could take hours to appear, or in some cases hardly at all. Lividity, the pooling of blood in the lowest parts of the body that creates purple-red discoloration, could look similar to bruising or certain disease processes. Decomposition would eventually provide irrefutable proof of death, but decomposition takes days, sometimes weeks, and you can't exactly wait that long to bury someone, especially in warm weather. So doctors made their best guesses, and sometimes they guessed wrong. Historians still argue whether medical schools adequately trained physicians in death diagnosis during this period, or whether the profession simply accepted a level of uncertainty that we would consider unconscionable today. What's clear is that the uncertainty was real, documented, and widespread enough that it became a genuine public health concern, or at least a genuine public anxiety. The fear wasn't irrational either. You're lying there in the warm dark listening to these words, and you might think that surely if a person woke up in a coffin, they could just kick or punch their way out. But that assumes you'd have the strength, the presence of mind, and the physical ability to do so. What if you woke up paralysed? What if your first sensation was suffocation, panic, and absolute confusion about where you were? What if your vocal cords wouldn't work? What if the wooden coffin was too sturdy, too well constructed for panicked hands to break through? These weren't abstract philosophical questions in 1800s America. These were the specific nightmares that kept people awake. The terrifying statistics emerged gradually, surfacing in medical journals, newspapers, and the worried correspondence of doctors who were beginning to take the premature burial questions seriously. By the 1870s and 1880s, various physicians and researchers had attempted to compile data on how many people might actually be buried alive each year in America. The numbers they came up with were staggering, or so it seemed, though here's where things get murky, because the statistics were often based on hearsay, unverified reports, and what we might charitably call speculative extrapolation. Some estimates put the number of premature burials in America at anywhere from 1 in 1,000 deaths to 1 in 10,000, depending on which doctor you asked, and how generous they were being with their assumptions. If you accepted the higher estimates, you were talking about hundreds of people every year being buried alive across the country. Hundreds. That's the kind of number that makes people sit up and take action. That's the kind of number that gets newspaper editors excited and entrepreneurs thinking about solutions. The documented cases, the ones that made it into print and thus into the historical record, were almost always sensational in nature. A woman supposedly revived during her own funeral service and sat up in the coffin, terrifying mourners. A man was exhumed 3 days after burial and found to have scratched marks all over the inside of his coffin, suggesting he'd woken up and tried desperately to escape. A child was buried with a bell around her wrist, connected by a string to a bell above ground that was meant to alert the sexton if she moved, and the bell supposedly rang in the middle of the night on her first day underground. These stories circulated in newspapers, got repeated in medical journals, and eventually made their way into books, pamphlets, and private correspondence. Each retelling added details, heightened the drama, and moved the story further from whatever kernel of truth might have originally existed. Here's a quirky aspect of this panic that people often overlook. The exaggeration wasn't always intentional. Grief does strange things to people's minds. A family who lost someone might hear a noise from the graveyard, an animal settling earth, the normal sounds of a cemetery at night, and their grief-stricken brains would interpret it as proof that their loved one was alive in the ground. They'd exhume the coffin, find nothing unusual, but the experience would cement their belief that premature burial was real and imminent. Then they'd tell that story, and someone else would hear it and add their own interpretation, and within a few years, it had become a legend. You're settling deeper into your pillows now, and you're probably thinking that surely people weren't that gullible, that surely the educated classes didn't fall for these stories. But they did. Doctors believed them. Newspapers printed them as fact. Families made decisions based on them. The exhumed coffins that were actually examined by credible observers did reveal some unsettling facts. Scratch marks on wooden coffin liners were found occasionally, though modern forensic analysis suggests these could have been made post-mortem by decomposing tissue, settling bones, or even root systems pressing into the wood. But in the 1800s, there was no forensic analysis. There was just a coffin with marks on the inside, and a doctor looking at it, and the imagination filling in the rest. Some exhumations revealed that the body's position had changed since burial, supposed evidence that the person had moved, thrashed, tried to escape. Again, we know now that bodies shift during decomposition as gases escape and tissues collapse, but that knowledge didn't exist in the 1870s. Historians still argue whether the documented cases of premature burial in 19th century America number in the dozens, the hundreds, or whether many of them never happened at all and exist only in the murky depths of Victorian folklore. What matters, though, is that the reports were out there, they were being taken seriously, and they were feeding a panic that was becoming self-sustaining. Newspapers would report a case of suspected premature burial. The story would spread. Other people would become anxious. They'd start hearing scratching sounds in cemeteries, sounds that had always been there, but that they now interpreted as evidence of live burials. Their anxiety would feed new stories, which would feed new newspaper articles, which would feed new anxiety. It was a feedback loop of pure, infectious fear. You're breathing steadily now, but imagine being alive during this time, hearing these stories accumulate, and not knowing which ones were true. Imagine having to decide, based on the medical knowledge available to you, how dead someone had to seem before you'd agree to bury them. Imagine worrying that the person you were mourning had actually been alive the whole time, screaming silently in the dark underground. Cholera's paralytic mimicry was perhaps the single biggest culprit in feeding the premature burial panic of the 1800s. When cholera swept through American cities, and it did, repeatedly, with devastating force, it created a perfect storm of conditions that could fool even experienced physicians into declaring someone dead when they were actually still alive. You need to understand what cholera does to a body. It's a bacterial infection that attacks the intestines and causes catastrophic fluid loss. Within hours of infection, a person can lose nearly all the water in their body. They become profoundly dehydrated. Their skin takes on a bluish-grey pallor. Their eyes sink into their sockets. Their extremities become cold as the body's circulation collapses inward. And then, and this is the crucial part, they can enter a state of profound shock. In this shock state, a person might appear completely unresponsive. The pulse becomes so weak it's nearly impossible to detect. Breathing becomes so shallow you can barely see the chest move. The skin becomes clammy and cold. By every external measure, the person looks dead. They look like death itself, but the nervous system hasn't completely shut down. Consciousness might still be present, trapped inside a body that's no longer responding to external stimuli. The person might still be able to hear, to feel, but absolutely unable to move or respond. It's a nightmare scenario, and it's not theoretical. Cholera survivors from this era have left accounts of waking up in the grave or in the morgue, describing the absolute terror of being paralysed and unresponsive, while people made funeral arrangements around them. When cholera epidemics hit American cities, New York in 1832, New Orleans repeatedly throughout the 1830s and 1840s, and then major cities again in the 1850s and 1860s, the death rate was so high and the pace so frantic that proper death diagnosis became almost impossible. Hospitals and pest houses were overwhelmed. The bodies piled up faster than they could be prepared for burial. Doctors were working exhausted, seeing dozens of patients, making snap judgments about who was definitely dead and who might still have a chance. In this chaos, the margin for error grew enormous. Someone would be brought in with classic cholera symptoms. They'd enter that shock state. A rush doctor would declare them dead. They'd be thrown into a mass grave with dozens of other cholera victims. And then, hours later, or even a day later, they might wake up. Except by then they were already underground, possibly with a dozen other bodies, possibly with lime being dumped on them to speed decomposition. Here's a quirky medical fact that fascinated and horrified doctors of the era. Cholera could cause a condition called cholera asphyxia, where the body would go into such profound shock that it seemed to have stopped functioning entirely. But in some cases, the body hadn't actually stopped, it had just paused. The heart was beating so slowly and so weakly that a stethoscope couldn't detect it. The breathing was so shallow that a mirror held to the nose wouldn't fog up. But the person's brain was still there. Consciousness was still present. We know this now because of the detailed accounts given by some cholera patients who recovered after being mistakenly declared dead. They described the absolute horror of regaining consciousness in darkness, underground, unable to move or scream. Some of them had permanent psychological damage from the experience. Some never fully recovered from the trauma. The cholera epidemics also created a practical problem that made disease diagnosis harder. When you're in the middle of an epidemic and hundreds of people are dying, you don't have time for the careful observation and testing that you might do in normal circumstances. You make quick decisions, you err on the side of caution, or you don't. And sometimes erring on the side of caution means keeping someone alive longer, but sometimes it means pronouncing someone dead so that a hospital bed opens up for someone who might be saved. The pressure to move bodies out of overflowing hospitals was immense. The pressure to move them to mass graves and get them underground before they started to decompose and spread more disease was overwhelming. In that pressure, accuracy gets sacrificed for speed. Historians still argue whether cholera-specific premature burials actually occurred with any regularity, or whether the fear of them was entirely disproportionate to the actual risk. What's certain is that cholera created conditions where premature burial was theoretically possible, and where the error would be extremely easy to make. And in an era when people were already terrified of death and uncertain of medical science, that theoretical possibility was enough to feed an entire panic industry. Catalepsy, the sleeping curse as some people called it, was perhaps even more insidious than cholera, because it could strike anyone, in any circumstance without warning. While cholera was a disease that announced itself with pain and obvious symptoms, catalepsy was a sneaky ghost of a condition that could make a perfectly healthy-looking person appear dead without any preceding illness. Catalepsy is what we'd now call a catatonic state, a dissociative condition where the body becomes rigid and unresponsive while consciousness persists somewhere in the depths of the mind. The person is awake but unable to move. The person can hear you but cannot answer. The person is fully, terrifyingly aware but absolutely locked inside their own body. In the 19th century, doctors didn't fully understand catalepsy. They knew it existed. They had documented cases, but they didn't know what caused it, how long it might last, or how to distinguish it from actual death. A person could enter a cataleptic state and seem completely, unmistakably dead. No pulse, or at least not one that anyone could find. No visible breathing, no response to stimulus, rigid muscles that felt like death, cold skin, the whole presentation of death, except that somewhere deep inside the person was still thinking, still aware, still hoping someone would figure out they weren't actually dead. There are accounts, and these are documented in medical journals of the era, so they're not pure folklore, of people who were assumed to be in cataleptic states, placed in coffins, and then revived before burial, or discovered to be alive during the funeral service. One particularly chilling case from the 1870s involved a woman in Boston who fell into what appeared to be death. She was prepared for burial. She was placed in her coffin. During the funeral service, as the coffin was being lowered into the ground, her family noticed movement. They opened the coffin. She was conscious, terrified, unable to move or speak, but conscious. What if they hadn't noticed? What if the coffin had already been nailed shut? What if she'd been lowered into the ground, still aware? Here's a quirky detail that illustrates how mysterious catalepsy seemed to the medical profession. Some doctors theorized that catalepsy might last for hours, days, or even weeks. They had no mechanism for understanding the condition, so they imagined the worst. A person could be in catalepsy for a month, they thought. The person could be awake the whole time, aware of everything, but absolutely unable to communicate. And if that person got buried on day 2 of a month-long cataleptic episode, well, that person was going to wake up in a coffin and have a very, very bad time. The psychological impact of knowing that catalepsy existed and could strike anyone cannot be overstated. You could be healthy. You could go to sleep. You could wake up unable to move. Doctors might examine you and declare you dead. And then you'd be in the ground. Every person who knew about catalepsy carried this fear with them. Some people became obsessed with it. They'd leave instructions in their wills about how to verify they were truly dead before burial. They'd request that their heads be cut off, or their hearts removed before interment, just to be absolutely certain. They'd ask family members to watch them during any illness, alert for the first sign of catalepsy. Catalepsy also raised an unsettling philosophical question that doctors debated in their journals. If someone was in catalepsy and appeared completely dead, with no apparent consciousness, no response to stimulus, how could you know they weren't actually dead? What's the difference between being dead and appearing to be dead while remaining unable to indicate consciousness? It's a question that still doesn't have a fully satisfying answer, even in the modern era. But in the 1800s, without EKGs or brain scans, it was an absolutely terrifying question. It suggested that death diagnosis might be fundamentally impossible, that you could never be truly certain you weren't burying someone alive. Historians still argue whether cataleptic states were actually as common in the 19th century as contemporary accounts suggest, or whether the condition has become rarer in the modern era. What's not debatable is that the fear of catalepsy drove enormous amounts of anxiety during this period and fed directly into the premature burial panic that was sweeping the nation. Coffin bells and their promise. This is where the premature burial panic transforms from pure fear into something almost comical, except that it wasn't comical to the people living through it. Coffin bells were actual devices, real commercial products, that you could install in your coffin before burial. They were meant to alert the living if you woke up underground. The basic design was simple. A bell was mounted in a box or cage attached to the lid of the coffin. A string or wire connected from the bell down through the coffin to rest on the corpse's hands or chest. If the person woke up and moved, or if decomposition gases caused the body to shift and bloat, the movement would pull the string, ring the bell, and alert the sexton who was supposedly stationed nearby to listen for it. The idea was, in theory, foolproof. The problem in practice was that almost every aspect of it didn't work. First, the bell was supposed to ring loudly enough to alert someone on the surface, but it had to be positioned in a way that made it accessible. Most coffin bells were placed in a box on the coffin lid, with the entire device sitting in the grave. Sound doesn't travel well through earth. A bell ringing 6 feet underground, even a reasonably loud bell, would be barely audible on the surface, especially to a sexton who might be distracted or not expecting to hear anything. Second, the string mechanism was prone to breaking, degrading, or simply failing to work properly. Third, and most problematic, there was no guarantee that anyone would actually be stationed above the grave to listen for the bell. Graveyards were large. The sexton had other duties. There was no way to ensure that the bell, if it did ring, would actually be heard and acted upon before the person underground suffocated. But people loved the idea anyway. The idea that you could take action, that you could install a device that might save you from live burial, was deeply comforting. It suggested that the terror could be controlled, mitigated, managed. So coffin bells became popular among wealthy Americans and the upper middle class. Some families had them installed in every coffin used by family members. Some wealthy individuals wrote into their wills that they wanted coffin bells. Manufacturers advertised them as essential safety equipment. The Baltimore coffin bell, the New York signal coffin, the patented alarm system designed by Dr. Franz Ferdinand Hartmann, these devices were marketed to anxious Americans as peace of mind in a box. Here's a quirky marketing detail. Some coffin bell manufacturers advertised that their particular design could also detect if the grave was being robbed, which was another Victorian anxiety. If grave robbers tried to dig up the coffin, the motion would ring the bell and alert nearby people. It was a 2-for-1 fear management device, protection against premature burial and grave robbery in one convenient package. For someone living in the 1800s and worried about both possibilities, it probably seemed like a reasonable expense. The devices were also often promoted with testimonials, real or invented, from people who claimed the bells had saved their lives or the lives of loved ones. A woman supposedly woke up in her coffin, heard the bell above her, and managed to ring it just as the sexton was walking past. A child was thought to have been buried alive, but the bell alerted her family before anything tragic could happen. The testimonials were marketed hard, printed in newspapers, shared in pamphlets, turned into the viral content of the era. Whether they were true or false, they convinced a lot of people that coffin bells were worth the investment. The wealthy went further. Some families had elaborate systems installed, bells connected to mechanisms that would pop the coffin lid open if pulled, or that would allow air to flow into the coffin if the body moved. Some coffins were built with multiple layers and escape hatches. Some had bells connected not just to the surface, but to bell pull systems that would ring loudly enough to alert the entire household of the deceased. The truly paranoid had multiple bells, multiple alarm systems, and left instructions for family members to stand watch over their graves for several days after burial, just listening. Historians still argue whether any coffin bell actually ever saved anyone's life, or whether the devices were purely psychological comfort, with no practical benefit whatsoever. The evidence suggests the latter, that coffin bells were a manifestation of public anxiety given form, a technology that promised safety but delivered mostly false reassurance. But that didn't stop people from buying them. That didn't stop manufacturers from promoting them. In times of fear, people will buy almost anything that promises to protect them from the source of their fear, whether it works or not. Safety coffins flooded the market during the peak of the premature burial panic, and the variety of designs is almost staggering when you look at the patents and advertisements that survive from the era. If coffin bells were the basic, affordable option, safety coffins were the premium, full-featured response to premature burial terror. These were coffins designed from the ground up, with the assumption that the person inside might wake up and would need a way to communicate or escape. They range from clever to baroque to absolutely impractical, and entrepreneurs were making real money selling them to terrified Americans. One of the most famous safety coffin designs came from Dr. Franz Ferdinand Hartmann, a physician who believed so strongly in the premature burial threat that he patented an elaborate system involving a bell, a tube for fresh air, and a box on the coffin lid that contained an escape mechanism. If the buried person moved, the bell would ring. If they needed air, they could breathe through the tube. If they needed to escape, they could theoretically use a spring-loaded device to push the coffin lid open. The Hartmann coffin was expensive, too expensive for most people, but the wealthy bought them, and they were marketed as the cutting edge of death safety technology. Another popular design was the safety coffin proper, coffins that had a spring-loaded lid that could be pushed open from the inside, or that had an air tube running to the surface, or that had a bell mechanism combined with an air supply system. Some coffins were built with multiple compartments and reversible lids. Some had windows so that people visiting the grave could see the deceased and confirm they were definitely dead. The idea was that if a person did wake up in the coffin, they'd have options: signal for help via the bell, breathe through the air tube while waiting to be rescued, push the lid open and climb out, or at minimum have enough air and comfort to survive for hours until someone realised what had happened. Here's a quirky aspect of the safety coffin boom that's actually kind of charming. Some coffin makers clearly didn't really understand the practical realities of what they were trying to solve. They'd design elaborate systems that looked impressive but would never have worked in actual use. A coffin with an escape hatch that required the buried person to have the strength to push through packed earth above the coffin. A bell system so quiet it would never be heard on the surface. An air tube that was too thin to actually provide meaningful ventilation. The designs looked good in advertisements and patents. They gave people the psychological comfort of feeling like they were taking action against the threat. But many of them would have been completely useless in an actual premature burial scenario. The market for safety coffins was booming by the 1880s. Manufacturers were advertising in newspapers, displaying their coffins at medical conferences, and getting testimonials from doctors, some real, some almost certainly invented. The coffins were expensive, often 2 to 3 times the cost of a regular coffin, but for wealthy families anxious about the prospect of burying a living person, the expense was justified. You were paying for peace of mind. You were paying for the technological ability to stave off a parent's worst nightmare. Some coffin makers got creative with their marketing. They'd advertise the safety coffin as not just a protection against premature burial, but as a status symbol, proof that you loved your family members so much that you'd spare no expense to protect them from this ultimate horror. They'd emphasize the craftsmanship, the materials, the engineering that went into each model. They'd publish lists of notable families who used their coffins. They'd offer custom designs and personalization. In some ways, they were running very modern marketing campaigns, just with the particular anxiety of the era as their hook. Historians still argue about how many safety coffins actually got sold and used, versus how many were purchased by wealthy people as a form of insurance against a threat that never materialized. The evidence suggests that the market for these coffins, while real, was smaller than the market for coffin bells and other simpler solutions. The truly paranoid and wealthy bought them. Others bought them because they were fashionable, or because they wanted to appear to be taking the threat seriously. But the majority of Americans, even those worried about premature burial, probably couldn't afford a safety coffin and had to make do with anxiety and prayer. The anatomy of a Victorian coffin, what your casket actually looked like inside those sealed chambers, is more important than you might think to understanding the premature burial panic. A Victorian coffin wasn't just a box. It was a specifically designed piece of furniture, built to contain a body and keep it separated from the earth. Most coffins of the era were made from wood, usually pine or walnut for the wealthy. They were lined on the inside with fabric, typically muslin or wool, and padded with sawdust or cotton batting. The shape was distinctive, wider at the shoulders, narrower at the feet, with a 6-sided profile. This shape was specifically designed to fit a human body in repose. The coffin was sealed with a lid that was nailed shut after the body was placed inside. Nails were driven through the lid and into the wooden sides of the coffin, creating an airtight seal. Once the nails were in place, the coffin was essentially a sealed box. Any person inside would have the air contained in the coffin space to breathe. Depending on the size of the coffin, and how full it was with the body, burial clothes, flowers and other items, the amount of breathable air could be quite limited. A study done in the 1880s by a doctor attempting to determine if premature burial was actually possible estimated that a typical coffin contained roughly 40 to 50 cubic feet of space, and that a human could survive on that amount of air for approximately 6 to 12 hours before running out of oxygen. The problem was that nobody actually knew these calculations at the time the coffins were being sealed. You just nailed the lid shut and sent the coffin into the ground. What happened next was speculation and anxiety. Would the person survive? How long would they last? Would they eventually suffocate? Or would panic and the horror of the situation kill them first? These questions haunted the minds of people who were worried about premature burial. They'd imagine a family member trapped in a coffin, conscious and aware, the air growing stale, the panic setting in, the slow realization that nobody was coming to help. It's a specific kind of claustrophobic nightmare. Here's a quirky detail about Victorian coffins. The cheapest ones were made very simply, with minimal padding and a thin wooden shell. The expensive ones, the ones used by wealthy families, were often lined with silk, padded generously with wool and cotton, and even carpeted on the inside. The wealthy coffin might be more comfortable if you were dead, but if you were alive in there, that extra padding didn't really help. A coffin is a coffin, ultimately, and being alive in one is a nightmare regardless of the thread count of the lining. Some coffin makers also incorporated glass windows into the design, oval or rectangular glass panes in the lid that would allow people visiting the grave to see the deceased. The idea was that you could look through the window and confirm that yes, the person was definitely dead, definitely buried, definitely not going to wake up. In practice, the glass would get dirty quickly, and the view would be obscured by dust and degradation. But the glass windows were a selling point. They suggested that the coffin was designed with rationality and verification in mind, that you could take steps to confirm death rather than just hoping you'd gotten it right. The coffin was also designed to be carried and handled by pallbearers and gravediggers. It had handles built into the sides. It was the right weight to be manageable, but heavy enough to convey solemnity and respect. The design was standardized enough that most coffins could be handled similarly, but custom enough that wealthy families could have their coffins made to specific tastes. You could get a coffin with particular wood types, particular shapes, particular fabric linings. You could have your coffin made to fit a particular person's dimensions. Some families even had trial fittings where the person being buried could lie in the coffin before death to ensure it was comfortable. Though again, if you were alive in the coffin, comfort became academic pretty quickly. The fact that coffins were nailed shut was crucial to the premature burial panic. If the coffin had been screwed together with bolts, or if the lid could be pushed open from the inside, the terror would have been significantly reduced. But nails meant permanent seal. Nails meant that once the coffin was closed, the only way to open it again was with tools and effort. A person trapped inside couldn't just push the lid open. They'd have to break through wood, or somehow signal for help or accept their fate. This finality, the idea that the coffin could only be opened by someone on the surface who had tools and knowledge, was absolutely central to the fear. You're in a box, sealed forever, and all your salvation depends on someone above ground realizing what's happened before it's too late. Historians still argue whether the coffin designs of the era made premature burial more or less likely, or whether the design was essentially irrelevant to the probability of the event. What's clear is that the coffin design fed into the panic. People looked at coffins, sealed, dark, designed to contain a body for underground, and imagined being trapped inside one conscious. The imagination did the rest. Decomposition's acoustic horror, why bodies made sounds that resembled scratching and knocking, is the crucial detail that turns the premature burial panic from pure psychological fear into something that felt empirically confirmed. When a body decomposes, it doesn't do so silently. There are sounds, there are movements, there is noise, and if you're convinced that a live person trapped in a coffin would make scratching and knocking sounds trying to escape, then the natural sounds of decomposition become evidence of premature burial. Here's how decomposition actually works, stripped of medical jargon. After death, the bacteria in and on the body begin to consume the tissue. This process generates gas, carbon dioxide, methane, hydrogen sulfide, and others. The gas builds up in the body's cavities and tissues. The decomposing body bloats. It moves as the gas pressure increases and decreases. The tissues break down and hard things, bones, cartilage, can shift and settle. If the body's in a sealed space like a coffin, the pressure builds even more. The movement is more pronounced, and the sounds, the groans, the creaks, the rustles as tissue breaks down and the body settles can be genuinely unsettling. Some of these sounds could reasonably be mistaken for scratching. Some could sound like someone clawing at wood. This is where the panic becomes self-fulfilling. A gravedigger hears a sound from a newly buried coffin. The sound is almost certainly decomposition. But the gravedigger doesn't know that. The gravedigger has heard stories about premature burial. The gravedigger's imagination goes to work. The sound becomes evidence. The gravedigger tells someone else. Within days, the story is that a coffin was heard, making scratching sounds. The unmistakable evidence of someone buried alive trying to escape. The coffin gets exhumed. It's examined. Signs of decomposition are interpreted as signs of struggle. Marks on the wood are interpreted as scratching from fingernails. And the panic gets fed another piece of fuel. People also projected their expectations onto the bodies they exhumed. If they exhumed a coffin expecting to find evidence of struggle, they would see struggle. A body shifted position by decomposition was a body that had been moving, fighting, trying to escape. Fingernails that had broken and decomposed were fingernails that had been clawing at the coffin. Blood that had pooled internally or pooled around the face was blood from the effort of fighting. The human mind is very good at finding patterns and meaning in ambiguous visual information, and when you're looking at a decomposed body expecting to find evidence of panic and struggle, you're going to find it whether it's actually there or not. Here's a quirky fact. Some of the most famous cases of supposed scratching marks inside coffins were examined by legitimate scientists in the 20th century. Their conclusion was that the marks could have been made by tools during coffin construction, by decomposition of the wood itself, or by post-mortem settling and movement of the body. But that conclusion came decades after the original discovery and panic. In the moment when the coffin was exhumed and the marks were seen, there was no systematic way to determine their origin. There was only fear and assumption. The horror of the sounds also fed into the panic because it made the threat feel immediate and present. You didn't need to imagine something that might happen in the future. You could go to the graveyard right now and potentially hear it. You could potentially hear your loved one trying to escape. This sense that the horror was present, ongoing, audible if you just paid attention, kept the fear alive and infectious. Graveyards became places where people heard things. Sounds that had always been there, animals, wind, settling earth. The normal acoustic phenomena of a cemetery became potential evidence of live burial. Gravediggers became key figures in the premature burial narrative precisely because they were the people most likely to hear the sounds. They worked in graveyards. They were digging and moving soil and handling coffins. They were ideally positioned to notice if something was amiss. So when a gravedigger reported hearing scratching, their testimony was taken seriously. Even if the gravedigger was partially deaf, or had never actually gotten close to the coffin, or was embellishing a story they'd heard somewhere else, their testimony carried weight. Gravediggers were the witnesses to premature burial, the people who might literally hear the person calling for help from underground. Historians still argue whether any of the documented cases of scratching sounds in coffins were actually caused by a living person trying to escape, or whether they were all decomposition sounds misinterpreted through a lens of fear. The evidence strongly suggests the latter, but the doubt itself was part of the panic. You couldn't be completely certain. You couldn't rule it out. And that uncertainty was enough. Gas build-up in sealed boxes, the science of putrefaction creating pressure and movement, is the actual, boring, not supernatural explanation for most of the sounds and phenomena that convinced people premature burial was happening. But in the 1800s, this explanation wasn't widely understood or believed, so the alternative, that actual living people were being buried alive, seemed more plausible. When a human body decomposes, it produces gas, a lot of gas. The process starts immediately after death, as bacteria begin to consume the body's tissues. These bacteria are anaerobic. They don't need oxygen, so they thrive in the sealed environment of a coffin. They consume muscle tissue, organs, skin, and in the process generate byproducts: methane, carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide. The gas accumulates in the abdominal cavity, in the lungs, throughout the body's tissue. The pressure builds, the abdomen bloats, the pressure increases, the body expands, and in a sealed coffin, that expansion creates pressure against the wooden sides. This pressure can actually cause the coffin to creak and groan. The wood flexes. The nails holding the lid down experience stress as the pressure from inside increases. In some cases, the pressure might even be enough to pop the coffin open if the seal isn't perfect, or if the coffin is particularly well made and the pressure is particularly intense. Some exhumed coffins from the era were found with broken lids or sides, and this was interpreted as evidence that someone inside had broken their way out. Modern forensic analysis suggests that some of these breaks were instead caused by the pressure of decomposition, gases pushing outward against the wooden container. The bodies also release fluids as they decompose. The tissues break down and liquefy. These fluids pool and move inside the coffin. If someone were to open a coffin that had been buried for several days, they might find that the body had shifted position. The fluids had moved, the body had settled or spread out. To someone not educated in decomposition, this could look like the body had been thrashing around, trying to move, trying to escape. It could look like evidence of life. Here's a quirky detail. The faster decomposition happens, the more gas is produced and the more movement occurs. In warm weather, decomposition is faster and more vigorous. In cold weather, it's slower. This meant that summer burials were theoretically more likely to produce the sounds and movements that could be misinterpreted as evidence of premature burial, which meant that summer was peak season for premature burial panic. As the weather warmed, more stories emerged, more coffins were exhumed, more evidence was found. Then winter would come, decomposition would slow, fewer stories would emerge, and people might relax slightly before the next spring brought new panic. Some of the sounds described in premature burial accounts could actually be explained by gas escaping from the coffin. If the seal wasn't perfect, if the wood had warped or the nails had rusted, gas could escape. And gas escaping from a coffin full of decomposing tissue produces a smell and sound. Witnesses might hear a hissing or whistling sound of gas escaping. They might smell the putrefaction. These sensations, combined with the knowledge that a human body was underground in that spot, could be easily reinterpreted as evidence of a live person somehow communicating from the grave. The medical understanding of decomposition in the 19th century was spotty at best. Doctors knew it happened. They didn't fully understand the mechanics. The scientific knowledge existed in medical literature, but it wasn't widespread. And even when some doctors tried to explain the phenomenon, tried to tell people that the sounds they were hearing were decomposition, not a live person, they were often not believed. The explanation seemed too clinical, too dismissive of the horror. Surely, people thought, the doctors were just trying to calm people down. Surely the truth was being suppressed because it was too horrifying, which was ironically exactly backwards. The truth was actually less horrifying. The sounds were decomposition, not a live person. But because the truth seemed so unbelievable or boring, and the alternative explanation seemed so immediate and terrifying, people believed the alternative. The panic grew, the exhumations continued, the testimonies accumulated, and all the while, the actual process of decomposition was just proceeding as it had for millions of years, indifferent to whether the living were frightened by the sounds it made. Historians still argue about whether the medical profession adequately educated the public about decomposition and the natural sounds of a buried body, or whether doctors themselves were uncertain and passed that uncertainty on to their patients. What's clear is that the gap between the scientific explanation and the public understanding was wide enough for panic to take root and grow. Doctors' growing skepticism began to emerge in the medical literature by the 1880s, as physicians started to look more critically at the premature burial claims and found the evidence wanting. Not all doctors were skeptics. Plenty of them continued to believe that premature burial was a real and present danger. But a critical mass of medical professionals began to question the panic, to examine the documented cases with a more rigorous eye, and to push back against the idea that live burial was epidemic in America. The skepticism started with basic questions. Where were all these exhumed coffins with scratch marks? When you actually tried to track down documented cases, they were often third-hand accounts, stories heard from a friend of a friend. The original evidence was usually gone or inaccessible. The people involved couldn't be tracked down. When coffins were actually exhumed and examined by credible observers, the findings were ambiguous at best. There might be marks on the inside of the coffin, but were they definitely made by fingernails? Were they definitely post-mortem? Could they have been made during construction? The evidence didn't hold up well to scrutiny. Some doctors began to do actual experiments. They would seal bodies in test coffins or boxes and observe what happened as decomposition proceeded. They'd look for scratch marks. They'd measure the sounds produced. They'd examine the movements of the decomposing bodies. The results were almost universally consistent. Decomposition could produce sounds that might superficially resemble scratching, but they weren't the kind of deliberate, forceful marks that would be made by a conscious, desperate person trying to escape. Scratching made by active fingernails under pressure looked different from the marks observed in coffins. The scientists could tell the difference. But this evidence, when published in medical journals, didn't circulate widely among the general public. The panic had developed its own momentum, and evidence couldn't easily stop it. One particularly interesting case involved a doctor who deliberately kept detailed measurements of multiple exhumations over a period of several years. He would examine the coffins, look for any evidence of life, photograph the marks if they existed, and keep careful notes on whether they could be explained by decomposition. His conclusion, published in the 1890s, was that he had never found evidence of an actual premature burial. Every case he investigated had another explanation, but his careful scientific work was overlooked in favour of more sensational stories. Here's a quirky fact. Some doctors began arguing that the panic itself was actually more dangerous than premature burial. People obsessed with the fear of being buried alive were developing anxiety disorders. Some were demanding unnecessary exhumations, which caused problems for families and graveyards. Some were refusing to allow their loved ones to be buried at all, keeping bodies above ground in makeshift crypts. The psychological damage from the panic might have been worse than the actual risk of premature burial. These doctors were arguing essentially that the cure, the coffin bells, the safety coffins, the anxious obsession, was worse than the disease. Medical skepticism of the premature burial panic grew stronger as the 20th century approached. By the 1900s, most doctors were willing to state that premature burial, while theoretically possible, was extremely unlikely in practice. The evidence for it was anecdotal and weak. The mechanisms that would actually allow someone to survive being buried alive were dubious at best. The sounds that people interpreted as evidence of live burial could all be explained by decomposition. The panic was being driven by fear, imagination, and poor logic rather than by genuine danger. But skepticism from doctors didn't immediately kill the panic. Plenty of people didn't trust doctors anyway. Plenty of people had heard the stories and believed them more than they believed medical authorities. The panic had a life of its own by that point, fed by newspapers and storytelling and deep human anxiety about death and burial. Getting people to give up a fear they'd held for decades, a fear they'd made life decisions around, was a slow process. The irony is that the doctors' growing skepticism was itself eventually validated by developments that made premature burial even less likely. Better medical diagnostic tools, the rise of embalming, modern funeral practices. But those developments came after the peak of the panic, after people had already spent decades building coffin bells and safety coffins, and obsessing over death diagnosis. Historians still argue about what combination of factors ultimately convinced the public that premature burial wasn't the epidemic threat they'd feared. Doctors' skepticism, changed funeral practices, new technology, or simply a gradual generational shift as the people most deeply affected by the panic died and were replaced by people who didn't carry the same anxiety. Probably it was all of these things working together. Newspaper sensationalism at its peak, how yellow journalism amplified stories of the buried alive, turned the premature burial fear from a medical concern into a cultural phenomenon. By the 1870s and 1880s, newspapers had become a major force in American life. They were cheap to produce, widely distributed, and competed fiercely for readers' attention. The way to get readers' attention was to publish stories that were shocking, disturbing, sensational. And premature burial was the perfect story. It was genuinely scary. It involved death and the macabre. It was unusual enough to be interesting, and it could be made more dramatic and terrible with each retelling. Newspapers would report on stories of supposed premature burial with bold headlines and melodramatic language. Terror in the grave, woman buried alive discovers fate before it's too late. The horror beneath, coffin opened to reveal signs of desperate struggle. These headlines would run in papers across the country, repeated and reshared, each telling adding details or changing facts slightly. A story from a New York newspaper might be reprinted in Boston with alterations. The Boston version might be reprinted in Philadelphia with different alterations. By the time the story made it across the country, it bore little resemblance to whatever original incident, if any, had inspired it. The newspapers also had a tendency to present speculation as fact. A coffin was exhumed, and marks were found on the inside. The newspaper's report would state as fact that the marks were made by the person trapped inside trying to escape. No investigation, no scientific analysis, just the assumption that the scariest possible explanation was the true one. If a gravedigger reported hearing a sound from a grave, the newspaper would print it as "Sexton hears living woman calling from coffin." The calling was assumption, not observation, but the headline conveyed certainty. Here's a quirky detail about the newspaper coverage. Some papers became known for particularly sensational premature burial reporting. Their stories were more extreme, more detailed, more horrifying than what other papers ran. This created a sort of competitive sensationalism where different papers tried to outdo each other in the horror of their reports. The Boston Globe would print a story. The New York Times wanted its own story. Somewhere in the reporting, accuracy became secondary to sensationalism. Stories would be embellished, details would be fabricated, the line between journalism and fiction would blur significantly. Newspapers also benefited from the uncertainty of the era. Because medical science was genuinely uncertain about death diagnosis, newspapers could report on that uncertainty without technically lying. Doctors cannot agree on safest methods of death verification was technically accurate. There was disagreement among doctors, but the headline made it sound like the uncertainty meant that premature burial was a real possibility, when in fact the medical consensus was slowly moving towards skepticism. The newspapers capitalised on the gap between what doctors were saying and what the public was prepared to believe. The papers also created feedback loops with their readers. A person would read a sensational story about premature burial in the newspaper. That person would become anxious. They might write a letter to the editor expressing their anxiety and asking what could be done to prevent such a horror. The newspaper would publish the letter, thereby amplifying the fear. Other readers would see the letter and become anxious. Some of those readers might write their own letters. The newspaper would publish the most dramatic ones. Within weeks, you'd have an entire community convinced that premature burial was a real and present danger, all because the newspaper had published a story and readers had responded, and the newspaper had amplified the response. Some newspapers also ran advertisements for safety coffins, coffin bells, and other premature burial prevention devices. This created an interesting situation where the newspaper was both stoking fear through its reporting and profiting from solutions to that fear through advertising. The more fear there was, the more people would buy safety devices, the more advertisements could be sold. There was a genuine financial incentive to keep the panic alive and growing. The power of newspapers to shape public opinion during this era cannot be overstated. Television didn't exist. Radio was barely developing. Social media was a century away. Newspapers were the primary source of information outside of personal conversation and gossip. If the newspapers said premature burial was happening, then to most people, it was happening. They had no way to verify the stories independently. They had to trust that the newspapers were reporting accurately. And the newspapers, driven by competition and profit motive, were not interested in accuracy when sensationalism was more profitable. Historians still argue about how much of the premature burial panic was driven by genuine medical concern and how much was driven by newspaper sensationalism. The consensus seems to be that both factors played a role, but that newspapers amplified the fear far beyond what the medical evidence actually supported. The newspapers didn't create the fear out of nothing. The underlying anxiety about death and medical uncertainty was real, but they magnified it, distorted it, and kept it alive long past the point when the medical profession had mostly concluded it wasn't a serious threat. The Scottish gravedigger's tale, one of the most famous, probably fake accounts circulating in 1800s America, is a perfect case study in how a story could circulate, mutate, and become embedded in popular consciousness regardless of whether it was true. The tale typically went something like this. A gravedigger in Scotland, or sometimes Scotland was changed to England or Ireland or even America, is digging a grave when he hears a tapping sound. He listens more carefully. The tapping becomes clearer. It's coming from a coffin that was buried months or years ago. He manages to open the coffin. Inside he finds the body, but the body is in a different position than it was buried. The arms are raised, the fingernails are torn. The inside of the coffin lid is covered with scratch marks. The body had been alive in the coffin. The body had been trying desperately to escape. The body had slowly suffocated and died in darkness, conscious and aware the entire time. The story was infinitely adaptable. Sometimes the gravedigger was an older man with a guilty conscience about a previous burial. Sometimes the coffin had been buried for years, and the gravedigger was shocked to find it. Sometimes there was a miraculous twist. The gravedigger heard the tapping in time, got the coffin open, and the person inside was barely alive but could be revived. Sometimes the twist was tragic. The person was already dead by the time the coffin was opened, having suffocated just hours before discovery. The core elements, the sound, the opened coffin, the signs of struggle, the implication that someone had been buried alive, remained constant, but the specifics could be adjusted to make the story scarier, sadder, or more shocking, depending on who was telling it. The brilliant part of the story, from the perspective of its circulation and staying power, was that it was unverifiable. It supposedly happened in Scotland, or in the distant past, or in a town far away. The specific gravedigger wasn't identified. The specific cemetery wasn't named. The specific person who had been buried alive wasn't identified. It was impossible to track down and confirm. But because it was impossible to disprove either, it persisted. Any attempt to investigate the story would be met with, well, the details are lost to time, or the family kept it quiet, or The gravedigger moved away and nobody knows where he is now. The story was constructed in such a way that skepticism couldn't easily topple it. American newspapers ran this story repeatedly, often claiming to have new information about it, or a slightly different version. Different papers would cite each other as sources, creating a network of mutual reinforcement. If the Boston Globe had run a version of the Scottish gravedigger's tale, and the New York Times then published an article about the famous Scottish case reported in the Globe, readers would assume there must be something to it if multiple reputable newspapers were covering it. The story gained credibility simply through being repeated in multiple publications. Here's a quirky detail. The Scottish gravedigger's tale became so famous that it actually spawned related stories. People would claim to have a friend who knew the gravedigger, or claim to have a relative who had lived in the Scottish town where it happened. These second-hand connections gave people a sense of personal connection to the story, making them more likely to believe it and more likely to share it with others. The stories became a form of folk narrative, personal testimony to the horror of premature burial. Some people became obsessed with tracking down the true source of the Scottish gravedigger's story. They'd write letters to newspapers asking if anyone had more information. They'd publish their own articles claiming they'd found the real gravedigger or the real cemetery or the real person who'd been buried alive. Some of these amateur investigators would publish books attempting to document the true story of premature burial cases. But every attempt to pin down the original story failed. It was like trying to find the original source of a rumour. By the time you started investigating, the trail was cold, and the story had already mutated into a dozen different versions. The cultural impact of the Scottish gravedigger's tale was enormous. It was probably the single most cited supposed example of premature burial in American popular discourse. When someone wanted to make an argument that premature burial was real and dangerous, they'd reference the Scottish gravedigger's tale. When someone wanted to sell a safety coffin or coffin bell, they'd hint at tales like the Scottish one. When people talked about their fears of live burial, they'd often reference this specific story as the reason they were afraid. By the 1890s, skeptical observers began to notice that nobody could actually find any evidence that the Scottish gravedigger's tale was based on a real event. Researchers looked through Scottish records, they looked through British medical journals, they looked through cemetery records. They found nothing. The story appeared to have no basis in fact. It was a pure legend, a folklore narrative that had taken on a life of its own through repetition and adaptation. But even when researchers published their findings that the story was probably fictional, the story didn't die. People still believed it. People still cited it. The investigation into its truth simply became part of the story itself, another layer of mystery and intrigue. Historians still argue about whether the Scottish gravedigger's tale had some grain of truth that got distorted over time, or whether it was purely fictional from the start. The evidence suggests the latter, but the possibility of the former keeps the debate alive. What's absolutely certain is that the story, whether true or false, had an enormous impact on how Americans understood the risk of premature burial. The story fed the panic fed the story. Together, they created a self-sustaining narrative loop that persisted for decades. Female premature burial folklore, why women were supposedly more at risk than men, reveals the gender anxieties embedded in the Victorian fear of leave burial. Across the accounts and stories that circulated in the 1800s, there was a distinct pattern. Women were more frequently reported to be at risk of premature burial. The vast majority of famous cases, or purported cases, involved female bodies. The supposed victims of live burial were mothers, wives, daughters, young women, beautiful women. This pattern was not accidental. It reflected deeper anxieties about women's bodies, women's consciousness, and women's vulnerability that ran through Victorian culture. One explanation that circulated in medical and popular literature was that women had more delicate constitutions. They were more prone to fainting, to trance states, to the kind of profound unconsciousness that could be mistaken for death. This was actual pseudoscience, believed and promoted by legitimate doctors, but it was also a reflection of cultural attitudes toward women. Women were seen as more fragile, more prone to emotional extremes, more likely to suffer nervous conditions. Therefore, women were more likely to suffer catalepsy or other conditions that mimicked death. This logic was circular and wrong, but it was widely accepted. There was also a specifically gendered version of the fear related to women's health conditions. Childbirth complications, miscarriages, and hysteria The catch-all diagnosis for basically any emotional problem a woman experienced could cause women to fall into deep unconsciousness. Doctors, already uncertain about how to distinguish this unconsciousness from death, were even more uncertain when dealing with female patients. The assumption was that a woman who appeared to be dead might simply be in a hysterical faint, a state of emotional unconsciousness. But when should you assume the woman had recovered from the faint and had actually died? The uncertainty was exactly the kind that would lead to premature burial. Here's a quirky detail. Some of the most famous premature burial prevention devices were marketed specifically to women. Safety coffins designed for women's bodies, bells that were supposedly more sensitive to a woman's lighter touch, advertisements that featured women as the primary potential victims of live burial. The marketing recognised that women were seen as the vulnerable population most at risk, and exploited that assumption to sell products. The gendered nature of the fear created a gendered market for the solutions. The stories about female premature burial victims were also more likely to be presented with romantic or melodramatic elements. A young woman, beautiful and virtuous, falls ill. She seems to die. She's buried. Later, it's discovered she was alive. The story is tragic and romantic. The young woman's brief window of possible rescue passed without anyone knowing to look for her. The gendered nature of the storytelling made the fear feel more immediate and personal to women readers. They could imagine themselves in these scenarios. They could project their own anxieties onto the fictional victims. Some historical evidence suggests that women were actually more likely to have exhumations performed on their coffins. If a family was uncertain whether a woman was truly dead, they were more likely to request an exhumation to verify. Whether this was because they were genuinely more uncertain about female death, or because they placed more value on female bodies and wanted to be more careful, is unclear. But the pattern existed, and it fed into the broader cultural narrative that women were more at risk. The gendered nature of the fear also related to Victorian mourning practices. Women wore mourning clothes for longer periods after a death than men did. Women were more expected to express grief openly and emotionally. This cultural expectation may have meant that female family members were more likely to project their anxieties about a deceased woman onto the scenario of premature burial. The grieving wife or daughter might become convinced that the deceased woman had been buried alive, even without any evidence. The anxiety about the loss could transform into anxiety about premature burial, which was a way of keeping the fear of loss alive and active. Medical literature of the era also documented cases of women who supposedly revived after being pronounced dead or after beginning funeral preparations. These cases were presented as evidence of the particular vulnerability of women to being mistaken for dead when they were actually merely unconscious. The reasoning was circular. Women are more likely to be unconscious in ways that look like death. Therefore, more women are buried alive. Therefore, women's lack of consciousness is riskier. None of this was logically sound, but it was culturally pervasive. Historians still argue about whether the gender imbalance in premature burial accounts reflects a genuine difference in how women's deaths were diagnosed, or whether it reflects cultural biases in which stories got preserved and repeated. The evidence suggests it's primarily the latter, that women were more likely to be the subjects of these narratives because of cultural anxieties about women's bodies and vulnerability, not because women were actually more at risk. But the persistent gendering of the fear had real effects. Women were subjected to different death diagnostic procedures. Women's anxieties about death were taken differently than men's anxieties, and women's supposedly greater vulnerability became a cultural fact even if it wasn't biologically true. The psychology of Victorian mourning, why deep grief made the fear feel absolutely real, is crucial to understanding how the premature burial panic could grip even educated, rational people. Mourning in the 19th century was not a private, internal process. It was a public, ritualized, highly emotionally intense practice. When someone died, the family would enter a formal mourning period that could last months or years. During this time, the mourners would wear specific clothing, avoid certain social activities, and maintain an intense emotional focus on the dead person. The Victorian death ritual was designed to honour the dead and allow families to process grief, but it also created a psychologically intense environment where grief could magnify fears and anxieties. Grief is a unique psychological state. It's not just sadness, it's a specific kind of emotional distortion that affects how people think and perceive reality. When you're grieving, your mind becomes hypervigilant to anything related to the person you've lost. You might hear their voice in sounds, you might see their face in crowds, you might interpret random events as signs or messages from them. This isn't insanity, it's a normal part of grief. But it means that a grieving person is particularly vulnerable to misinterpreting sensory information in ways that confirm their worst fears. A widow grieving her recently buried husband hears a sound from the graveyard. Her rational mind knows it's probably wind or an animal or settling earth, but her grieving mind, desperate to maintain connection with her lost husband, interprets the sound as his voice, his call, his attempt to communicate. Her fear that he might have been buried alive, a fear that existed on some level before, but was perhaps dormant, activates. She becomes convinced. She tells her family. They hear the fear in her voice and become afraid themselves. Before long, the family is demanding an exhumation. The sound remains unexplained, but the meaning assigned to it has generated real consequences. This grief-driven misinterpretation wasn't limited to families. Entire communities could be caught up in the grief response. When a prominent person died, especially if the death was unexpected or occurred in ambiguous circumstances, the community would grieve. The community's collective grief would create a psychological environment where premature burial fears became especially acute. A community in grief would be more likely to interpret ambiguous evidence as proof of the thing they feared. A coffin would be heard to have sounds in it. The sounds would be interpreted as evidence of the person inside being alive. The community's fear would intensify. Here's a quirky detail. Some funeral customs of the era were actually designed to combat the grief-driven anxiety about premature burial. Viewing the body before burial was one such custom. The theory was that if you saw the body, saw clear signs of death, you would be more convinced that the person was actually dead. But in practice, the viewing often had the opposite effect. People in grief looking at a seemingly lifeless body might instead fixate on how much the person looked like they were just sleeping. They might convince themselves that the person was actually in some deep state of consciousness that merely looked like death. The viewing meant to dispel the fear actually reinforced it. The Victorian funeral process itself, the lengthy preparation, the formal ceremony, the multiple occasions to see and think about the dead body, created an extended period of grief during which the fear of premature burial could develop and intensify. A body wasn't buried the day it died. It was prepared, viewed, moved through the community, buried in a formal ceremony. Days could pass. During those days, the family's anxiety about premature burial could compound. What if the doctors had been wrong? What if their loved one was actually in a coma, not death? What if burial would wake them up? The extended timeline gave anxiety time to grow. Some people actually developed what we might now call obsessive-compulsive behaviours around premature burial due to grief. A person who had lost a family member to a disease with uncertain death diagnosis might become obsessed with preventing others from being buried alive. They might conduct research into coffin bells. They might write letters to newspapers. They might push for legal changes regarding death diagnosis. The obsession was, at some level, a way of maintaining connection with the deceased, by fighting against the thing that might have happened to them. The fear that the deceased person might have been buried alive would never fully go away, and it would drive behaviour for years. The role of religious belief also cannot be overlooked. 19th century Christianity often emphasised the resurrection of the body and the eternal nature of the soul. Some people believed that if a body was buried alive, the soul might still be trapped, unable to rest. This belief made the fear of premature burial spiritually as well as physically significant. It wasn't just about preventing suffering for the buried person, it was about allowing their soul to properly transition to the afterlife. A person could convince themselves that their deceased loved one was spiritually in danger of being buried alive, and that preventing premature burial was a spiritual duty. Historians still argue about how much the premature burial panic was a rational response to genuine uncertainty about death, and how much was an expression of grief and mourning anxiety given shape and language through cultural narratives. The most likely answer is that both factors played into it, that grief and uncertainty together created a uniquely fertile environment for the panic to take root and spread. Edgar Allan Poe's literary fuel, How One Author's Obsession Shaped Public Nightmares, is one of the clearest cases of literature feeding and shaping public anxiety in the 19th century. Poe didn't invent the fear of premature burial, but he did give it literary form. He wrote about it obsessively, exploring the nightmare of being buried alive through multiple stories and essays. His work was widely read, discussed, and remembered. The psychological intensity of his writing made the fear of premature burial feel less like an abstract possibility and more like an immediate, visceral reality. Poe's most famous premature burial story was The Fall of the House of Usher, published in 1839, though the premature burial fear runs through many of his works. In that story, Madeline Usher, the sister of the protagonist, is apparently dead from a wasting disease. She's buried in a vault. But then, weeks later, Roderick Usher hears sounds from the vault. Madeline appears, covered in blood from clawing her way out of her coffin. She had apparently been in a cataleptic trance when buried, had revived in the coffin, and had spent days trying to escape. The story ends tragically, with Madeline dying again along with her brother. Poe's vivid psychological description of Madeline's coffin experience, the darkness, the suffocation, the desperate clawing, created an incredibly powerful image of the horror of premature burial. What made Poe's work so influential wasn't just that it featured premature burial as a plot device. It was that Poe wrote about premature burial in a way that felt psychologically real. He didn't present it as a gothic fantasy or an impossible nightmare. He presented it as something that could actually happen, that could happen to anyone, and that would create a specific kind of psychological horror. His descriptions of being trapped underground, conscious and aware, knowing that you were about to suffocate, knowing that rescue was unlikely, knowing that you would die in darkness. These descriptions were vivid and psychologically accurate in their depiction of extreme fear and claustrophobia. Poe also wrote an essay specifically about premature burial, called The Premature Burial, published in 1844. In this essay, he discussed actual cases of premature burial and near premature burial, citing examples and analysing them. The essay was written in a tone that suggested these cases were documented facts, real occurrences that proved the danger was significant. Poe discussed his own anxiety about premature burial, his obsessive worry that he might be buried alive, his research into methods of prevention. By writing about his own anxiety and presenting it as reasonable, Poe helped to legitimise the fear for his readers. If Edgar Allan Poe, a famous and respected author, was afraid of premature burial, then surely premature burial was something worth fearing. Here's a quirky detail. Some of Poe's work on premature burial was plagiarised or adapted from earlier sources, but Poe's literary fame meant that his versions of the stories became the canonical versions. People read Poe's version of the story and assumed that if Poe was reporting on it, it must be real. The irony is that Poe was actually partially working from fictional sources himself, but his literary genius in adapting those sources made them feel real and true to his readers. Poe's version of premature burial became the version that stuck in the cultural consciousness. The influence of Poe's work extended beyond direct readers to the broader culture. His stories were adapted for theatre. They were reprinted in newspapers. They were discussed in salons and drawing rooms. Artists illustrated his stories, creating visual images of the horror of premature burial that circulated through society. Poe's version of the fear, psychological, interior, focused on the subjective experience of the buried person, became the version that dominated the culture. Later premature burial stories would often echo Poe's approach, borrowing his narrative techniques and psychological insights. Poe was also part of the broader literary culture of his era that was intensely focused on death, mourning, and the macabre. The Romantic movement in literature had elevated melancholy, death, and extreme emotion to aesthetic ideals. In this context, Poe's obsession with premature burial fit perfectly. It was melancholic, it was extreme, it was emotionally intense. It was the kind of subject matter that appealed to educated readers who enjoyed dark, psychologically complex literature. But the danger was that by making premature burial a subject of serious literary attention, Poe and his fellow writers were implicitly suggesting that it was a matter worth serious real-world attention as well. Interestingly, Poe's influence on the premature burial panic may have been less direct than people sometimes assume. His writing was read primarily by educated middle and upper-class readers. The broader panic gripped all levels of society, including people who probably had never read Poe. The influence of newspapers and word of mouth spread the fear more widely than literary works could. But Poe's writing did serve to validate and intensify the fear among educated readers, and to give the fear literary legitimacy. Even people who didn't directly read Poe would have encountered echoes of his ideas in other writings, in newspaper reports, in cultural conversations. Historians still argue about whether Poe's work caused the premature burial panic, fed into an existing panic, or simply reflected widespread anxiety that existed independently of his writing. The most reasonable conclusion is probably that Poe's work both reflected and amplified existing anxiety. He was writing about concerns that people already had, but his literary genius and the power of his writing made those concerns feel more real, more urgent, and more deserving of serious attention. After Poe's work, premature burial moved from a marginal medical concern to a significant cultural anxiety. Actual medical autopsies revealing truth, what happened when doctors opened coffins and examined bodies, provided some of the most concrete evidence about what actually occurred in buried coffins, though the evidence wasn't always clear-cut or easy to interpret. When exhumations took place and coffins were opened, physicians would sometimes conduct autopsy examinations to see if they could determine whether the person had been alive when buried. These autopsies were conducted by scientists trying to understand the reality of the situation, and their findings became part of the medical literature of the era. What the autopsies found was usually anticlimactic from a sensational perspective, but important from a scientific one. The bodies showed signs of decomposition consistent with the amount of time they had been buried. They showed no signs of the kind of desperate struggle that would be expected if someone had woken up alive in the coffin and tried to escape. The scratch marks found on coffin liners could usually be explained by post-mortem processes, tissue damage, bone settling, wood degradation. The positions of the bodies could be explained by the movement that naturally occurred during decomposition. In most cases, the evidence pointed to normal decomposition, not to someone having been alive and conscious in the coffin. One particularly famous autopsy examination was conducted by a physician in Boston in the 1870s who had examined several exhumed coffins and kept detailed records of his findings. He documented the appearance of decomposed bodies, the presence or absence of injuries, the state of the coffin, and any marks or disturbances. His conclusion, after examining multiple cases, was that he found no evidence of premature burial in any of them. Every body showed signs consistent with death having occurred before or at the time of burial. Every apparent sign of struggle could be explained by normal decomposition. But when he published his findings, they received little attention outside of medical circles. The public wanted horror stories, not scientific reassurance. Here's a quirky detail. Some of the autopsies revealed that certain supposed victims of premature burial had actually died of common medical conditions that were well understood. A person supposedly buried alive from cholera had actually died of the complications of cholera, not from being alive in a coffin. A person supposedly buried alive from catalepsy had instead been dead from natural causes. The deaths that the popular imagination had turned into premature burial cases were actually just normal deaths. But the scientific findings that would have dispelled the fear were less interesting than the sensational stories, so they didn't circulate widely. The autopsies also began to reveal information about the actual process of decomposition in coffins. Scientists could see how quickly decomposition occurred, what gases were produced, how the body changed over time. This information was valuable scientifically, but it was also valuable for debunking premature burial claims. It became clear that certain acoustic phenomena that people had attributed to live people in coffins were actually the normal sounds of decomposition. The physical changes they'd interpreted as evidence of struggle were normal decomposition changes. The scientific understanding was advancing, even if the public understanding was lagging behind. Some autopsies did reveal unusual findings. Occasionally they'd find fluid in the lungs of a decomposed body, or evidence of water in the airway, which could suggest that the person might have been alive when buried in a wet grave. But these findings were rare, and they were ambiguous. Fluid could accumulate in the lungs from decomposition, even if the person was already dead. The presence of fluid wasn't definitive proof of premature burial, it was just one of many possible explanations. Medical examiners also began to develop more systematic approaches to evaluating bodies and determining when death had occurred. They could look at the degree of decomposition and estimate how long a person had been dead. They could look at specific markers, the appearance of rigor mortis, the pattern of livor mortis, the state of decomposition, and determine with increasing accuracy whether someone could have been alive when buried. This developing science of forensic examination was gradually making the diagnosis of death more objective and reliable. Though it would take decades for this knowledge to spread beyond the medical profession, the irony is that by the time systematic science was confirming that premature burial was extremely rare or possibly non-existent, the cultural panic had already peaked and begun to fade. The scientific evidence arrived too late to prevent decades of anxiety, but it did contribute to the eventual decline of the panic by providing objective evidence that people could point to when trying to convince others that the fear was overblown. Historians still argue about whether the medical profession adequately communicated their findings to the public during this period, or whether doctors kept their findings confined to medical journals where they had limited impact. The evidence suggests that communication was limited, which meant that the scientific debunking of the panic was slower and less effective than it might have been if the findings had been publicised more broadly. The rise of embalming practices, how preservation techniques changed what bodies actually did underground, was one of the most significant factors in the eventual decline of the premature burial panic. Embalming, the practice of treating a dead body with preservative chemicals to prevent decomposition, became increasingly common in America during the second half of the 19th century. As embalming became more standard, it changed the fundamental nature of what happened to a body after death. If a body was properly embalmed, it wouldn't decompose the way an unembalmed body would. It wouldn't produce gases, it wouldn't make sounds, it wouldn't move or shift in the coffin, it would simply remain largely unchanged, preserved in a state of death. This development was significant for the premature burial panic for several reasons. First, if a body was embalmed, the phenomena that people had been interpreting as evidence of premature burial would no longer occur. An embalmed body wouldn't create the decomposition gases that made sounds. An embalmed body wouldn't move as tissue broke down. The acoustic evidence that supposedly proved live burial would simply disappear. Second, embalming itself was a process that seemed to definitively confirm death. If a person was truly going to be embalmed, there would be time for them to show signs of life. A person who was merely in a cataleptic state might revive during the embalming process. The fact that embalming could be performed without the person reviving seemed to suggest that the person was definitely dead. Embalming also had the effect of extending the time that a body could be preserved above ground. With an unembalmed body, burial needed to occur within days to prevent excessive decomposition and the health risks that came with it. With an embalmed body, the funeral could be delayed, allowing time for distant family members to arrive or for the community to properly observe the mourning rituals. This extended timeline gave more people a chance to see the body and confirm that the person was definitely dead. The extended above-ground preservation, combined with the visible effects of embalming, seemed to provide more certainty about death. Here's a quirky detail. Embalming was initially resisted by some segments of the population who saw it as unnatural or impious. But the promise that embalming could protect against premature burial actually helped convince people to accept the practice. The idea that you could be embalmed and thus protected from the horror of being buried alive was a compelling selling point. Embalming became not just a preservation technique, but a form of insurance against the thing people feared most about death. The technology of embalming also advanced during the second half of the 19th century. Early embalming techniques were crude and unreliable. Bodies would still decompose even after being embalmed. As the techniques improved, the preservation became more reliable. By the turn of the 20th century, a properly embalmed body could be preserved in a recognizable state for weeks or even months. This reliability meant that people could have more confidence that an embalmed body wouldn't suddenly wake up and need to escape. The person was clearly and obviously dead, and would remain so. The professionalization of embalming also contributed to reduced premature burial anxiety. Embalming became the work of trained professionals, morticians and funeral directors, rather than something done haphazardly by family members or gravediggers. These professionals had training in death diagnosis and embalming procedures. Their involvement in the process seemed to provide additional assurance that proper procedures were being followed and that death had been properly verified before preservation began. It's worth noting that embalming had another significant cultural effect. It made death seem more controllable, more managed, less horrifying. A decomposing body is objectively horrifying, is a process of dissolution and rot. An embalmed body, while still obviously dead, is preserved in a state that's more presentable, less disturbing. This change in how bodies appeared after death may have contributed to reduced anxiety about what was happening underground. If you'd seen an embalmed body and knew that bodies stayed in that preserved state, you'd have less anxiety about the horror of being trapped in a coffin with your own decomposing flesh. The shift toward embalming happened gradually, becoming standard practice by the early 20th century, long after the peak of the premature burial panic. So embalming wasn't the primary cause of the decline in panic, but it was a contributing factor. As people became accustomed to the embalming process and saw its effects, they became less anxious about what might happen after burial. The scientific understanding of decomposition advanced. Embalming provided a technological solution to the problem. The combination of better understanding and better technology made the fear of premature burial seem less rational and less urgent. Historians still argue about how much the shift toward embalming reflected genuine safety concerns about premature burial versus how much it reflected cultural changes and commercial interests. What's clear is that embalming became standard practice in America, and that this shift coincided with the decline of the premature burial panic. The two developments were connected, though the exact nature of the connection is debated. Wealthy families' extreme precautions, the insane lengths rich Americans went to protect against live burial, reveals just how seriously some people took the threat and how much fear was driving their decision-making. Wealth provided options that poor people didn't have. A wealthy family who was terrified of premature burial could afford to install whatever protections they wanted in their coffins. They could hire people to watch the grave. They could request exhumation and verification of death multiple times if they wanted. They could basically spend whatever money was necessary to ease their anxiety about premature burial. Some wealthy families installed elaborate systems in their coffins that combined bells, air tubes, escape hatches, and communication devices. They'd commission custom coffin makers to build these devices to their specifications. Money was essentially no object. The goal was protection, not economy. One wealthy Boston family, documented in historical records, had a coffin built with a spring-loaded lid that could be pushed open from the inside, an air tube running to the surface, a bell system, and a second internal lid that could be separated from the main coffin. The coffin was extraordinarily expensive, far beyond what any ordinary family could afford, but it was built for a family member who was terrified of premature burial. Another documented case involved a wealthy Philadelphia family that built a kind of elaborate above-ground crypt to contain their family member's coffin. The crypt was a stone structure with a roof and walls, and it was positioned in the cemetery in a way that allowed someone to access the coffin at any time. The idea was that if there was any question about whether the person was definitely dead, the coffin could be opened for verification without having to do a full exhumation. It was an expensive solution to a problem that most people would face for a few days and then move on from, but this family was determined to have the option to verify death indefinitely. Here's a quirky detail. Some wealthy people requested that their coffins be built with transparent panels or windows so that the body could be seen and verified without opening the coffin. The theory was that if you could visually confirm the state of the body, you wouldn't need to worry about the person being alive inside. You could literally see that decomposition was proceeding normally, and that the person was definitely dead. The windows also reflected a kind of morbid curiosity. The people built these coffins were paying to have the ability to look at their dead relatives indefinitely. Some wealthy families went even further and hired people to stand watch over the grave for days or even weeks after burial. These grave watchers would camp out in the cemetery, listening for any sounds from the grave, watching for any signs that something amiss might be happening underground. The financial investment in hiring grave watchers for extended periods was significant, but some families believed it was worth it for the peace of mind. If the person did wake up in the coffin and managed to signal for help, the grave watcher would hear it and could immediately raise the alarm. There were also cases of wealthy families requesting that the bodies of their dead relatives not be buried at all. Instead, they would keep the bodies in special mausoleums or crypts above ground where the bodies could be monitored indefinitely. In some cases, wealthy families would have multiple verification examinations of their relatives' bodies, performed by different doctors on different days, to ensure that there was no possibility of premature burial. The expense was enormous, but the psychological comfort of knowing that absolutely everything possible had been done to prevent live burial was apparently worth it to some people. Some wealthy individuals also became patrons of premature burial prevention technology. They'd fund research into better coffin designs, better diagnostic techniques for determining death, better systems for communication from beyond the grave. They'd sponsor inventors and engineers who were trying to develop new solutions to the premature burial problem. In some cases, the wealthy patron's name would be associated with the resulting technology. A particular coffin design would be named after the wealthy family who funded its development. The irony of all this extreme precaution is that the wealthy families who are most able to afford these protections were also the most educated and most likely to have access to the best medical care. They were the least likely to be misdiagnosed as dead when they were actually alive, yet they were often the most anxious and willing to spend enormous sums on protection. The wealth didn't ease the anxiety. If anything, the ability to indulge the anxiety with expensive solutions seems to have prolonged it and intensified it. Historians still argue about whether the extreme precautions of wealthy families reflect genuine assessment of risk, or whether they reflect anxiety and wealth combined into self-indulgent protection theatre. What's clear is that some wealthy Americans in the 19th century were willing to spend significant sums of money and effort trying to prevent a premature burial outcome that was probably vanishingly unlikely. The fear was real, and the resources to address it, at least materially, were available. Rural versus urban burial myths, why small towns and cities had different fears and practices, reveals how the premature burial panic was experienced differently depending on where you lived and the social context you inhabited. In urban areas, particularly in large cities with professional medical communities and funeral services industries, the panic took one form. In rural areas, where medicine was less advanced, doctors were fewer and further between, and traditional practices held more sway. The panic took a different form. In urban areas with developed medical and funeral industries, the panic often focused on technological solutions. City dwellers who were anxious about premature burial looked to coffin bells, safety coffins, and professional embalming as ways to manage their fear. These were products and services that required access to urban commercial infrastructure. You couldn't buy a coffin bell in a rural area that had no manufacturing or commercial distribution network. You couldn't hire an embalmer in a small town that had no professional funeral service. So the panic in rural areas took a different form. In rural areas, the panic was more likely to manifest as traditional practices and folk remedies. A rural family worried about premature burial might rely on folk diagnostic techniques, community watching, and traditional funeral practices. A gravedigger in a rural area might use traditional methods to verify death, checking for signs of decomposition, waiting for clear signs of rigor mortis, asking other experienced gravediggers for advice. The anxiety was no less real in rural areas than in urban areas, but the ways of addressing it were different. Here's a quirky detail. Some rural areas had very different burial practices than urban areas. In some rural communities, the body would be kept above ground for longer periods before burial, allowing time for decomposition to begin, and for the community to be absolutely certain that death had occurred. In other rural areas, traditional folk practices around death diagnosis were more respected than the opinions of formally trained doctors. The flexibility of rural practice meant that many families would follow the approach that seemed most sensible to them, rather than necessarily following the advice of a doctor. The rural-urban divide also related to trust in authority. Rural people were often sceptical of urban doctors and their pronouncements about death. A rural family might be more likely to rely on their own observation and the observation of family members than on the opinion of a doctor. This skepticism might actually have had a protective effect. By insisting on extensive observation before accepting that someone was dead, rural families might have been less likely to bury someone prematurely. Urban areas also saw more of the newspaper coverage about premature burial, because urban newspapers were more widely distributed and more likely to cover sensational stories. Rural areas had fewer newspapers, and the newspapers they had were often more focused on local news. This meant that the sensational national stories about premature burial might not have reached rural areas with the same intensity. The panic could feel more isolated and personal in rural areas, less driven by national media narratives. There were also class differences that overlapped with the rural-urban divide. Wealthy urban residents were more likely to buy expensive safety coffins and hire grave watchers. Wealthy rural residents might not have been able to buy these products because they didn't exist in their local market even if they had the money. So the expensive protections against premature burial were really products of urban, commercial, wealthy culture. Ordinary people in rural and urban areas alike were more likely to rely on traditional practices, community observation, and folk knowledge. The railroad and improving transportation network during the second half of the 19th century actually helped spread premature burial panic from urban to rural areas. Newspapers from major cities would be transported on trains to smaller towns. Stories about premature burial would circulate in rural areas. People in rural areas would become anxious about threats they might not have been aware of before. So urbanization and improved communication were contributing factors to the spread of the panic beyond its original urban base. Some rural areas also developed their own premature burial folklore. A small town might have local legends about people buried alive. These would be distinct from the urban newspaper stories, though the underlying anxiety was the same. The folklore would get passed down through generations in rural areas, and rural people would maintain the fear of premature burial, even as urban anxieties were beginning to fade. By the early 20th century, as rural areas became more integrated into urban commercial culture, the distinction between rural and urban experiences of the premature burial panic began to blur. Rural people had more access to urban products and services. Rural newspapers carried more national stories. More people moved between rural and urban areas. The rural-urban divide that had shaped the panic during the 19th century gradually diminished. Historians still argue about whether the premature burial panic was fundamentally an urban, upper-middle-class phenomenon that gradually spread to rural and lower-class populations, or whether rural areas had their own version of the panic that was distinct in character. The evidence suggests that both dynamics occurred, and that understanding the panic requires understanding how it operated differently in different contexts rather than treating it as a monolithic cultural phenomenon. The role of telegraph and photography, how technology spread panic faster than ever before in history, transformed the premature burial panic into something that could circulate nationally and internationally with unprecedented speed. The telegraph, invented in the 1840s, allowed information to be transmitted across long distances almost instantaneously. A story about a supposed premature burial in Boston could be telegraphed to New York, Philadelphia, and Washington within hours. The story could then be printed in afternoon newspapers in those cities on the same day it had occurred or been reported. This speed of communication was unprecedented in human history. Previously, a story would travel by mail, coach, or ship, taking weeks or months to move from one region to another. By the time the story arrived, new information might have emerged or the story's relevance might have faded. With the telegraph, stories could travel instantaneously while they were still fresh and could still generate strong emotional reactions. The telegraph made the premature burial panic viral in a very 19th century sense of the word. Photography, which developed rapidly in the 1850s and 1860s, added another dimension to how the panic could spread. A coffin could be photographed. The photograph could be copied and distributed. Suddenly people across the country could see, with their own eyes, a coffin that supposedly contained a person buried alive. The photograph made the reality feel more immediate and verified. The presence of a photographic image seemed to confirm that a story was true. You had visual proof. Photography extended the panic by making what had previously been only word-of-mouth rumour into something that seemed visually confirmed. Here's a quirky detail. Some of the photographs that circulated showing supposed evidence of premature burial were actually photographs of normal coffins, or coffins containing embalmed bodies. The photographs would be labelled with sensational captions that suggested they were evidence of live burial. The photograph itself wasn't lying, but the caption was. Someone seeing the photograph with the caption would naturally believe the story the caption was telling. The combination of photographic image and sensational caption was powerful and persuasive, even if the actual content of the photograph was ambiguous. Newspapers began to employ photographers to document stories. If a coffin was exhumed under suspicious circumstances, a photographer might be sent to photograph it. The photographs would be published in the newspaper, often on the front page. Readers would see the photographic evidence with their own eyes. They would be convinced by what they saw. The authority of the photograph, the sense that the camera was somehow recording objective reality, made the evidence seem irrefutable. The telegraph also changed the economics of newspaper publishing. Newspapers could now receive up-to-the-minute information and publish it quickly. This created competitive pressure for newspapers to publish the most dramatic, sensational stories. A newspaper in Boston would telegraph stories to newspapers in other cities. A A newspaper in New York might telegraph its own stories back to Boston. The stories would get picked up by other newspapers, each one adding details or embellishing slightly. By the time a story had cycled through multiple telegraphed retransmissions, it might bear little resemblance to the original. Photographs also became part of newspaper advertising. A manufacturer of safety coffins might publish a photograph of their coffin in a newspaper advertisement. The photograph would make the coffin seem real and reliable. Readers would see the photograph and feel reassured that a solution to their premature burial anxiety was available for purchase. The photograph was a powerful sales tool, even when the coffin had never actually saved anyone from premature burial. The telegraph and photograph together created a media environment where panic could spread faster and farther than ever before. A story could go from local news to national news within days. A photograph could reach thousands of readers. The repetition of stories across multiple newspapers and the circulation of photographs made the panic feel like it was happening everywhere, all the time. Even if premature burial was actually rare, the sense that it was common was created by the media's ability to report on and circulate whatever cases did exist. Some newspapers even began to deliberately telegraph sensational stories to other newspapers, knowing that the sensationalism would help spread the story and increase readership of both newspapers. The telegraph created a kind of collaborative sensationalism, where newspapers would share stories that would be reprinted in other cities, generating publicity and readership for all involved. Historians still argue about the degree to which technology was responsible for creating and spreading the premature burial panic versus the degree to which technology simply provided the mechanism for spreading anxiety that was already present. What's certain is that the telegraph and photography allowed the panic to reach a scale and speed that would have been impossible without these technologies. The panic was amplified by the ability to communicate it quickly and visually. Spiritualism's unexpected connection, why seances and ghost hunting actually link to premature burial terror, reveals an interesting intersection between the rational fear of medical uncertainty and the irrational belief in communication with the dead. Spiritualism was a religious and philosophical movement that gained significant popularity in the 19th century, particularly among educated middle-class people. Spiritualism was based on the belief that the living could communicate with the dead through mediums, people who claimed to have the ability to channel messages from deceased spirits. For people interested in spiritualism, the fear of premature burial took on an additional dimension. If a person was buried alive, their spirit might be trapped, unable to properly transition to the afterlife. The spirit might be in pain, in confusion, attempting to communicate their terrible fate to the living. A spiritualist might attend seances hoping to make contact with a deceased relative, partly to ask them directly whether they had been buried alive. The fear of premature burial could manifest as a desire to contact the spirit of the deceased and ask whether they had experienced that horror. If the seance was interpreted as confirming that the person had been alive when buried, the spiritualist would be devastated, but also finally have confirmation of what they'd feared. Spiritualists were also interested in trying to communicate with people who'd supposedly been buried alive. If a person was truly alive in a grave, their spirit might be able to reach out through a medium and communicate with the living, asking for help. Some spiritualists believed that they might be able to receive messages from people trapped in coffins, messages that could lead to the exhumation and rescue of those people. This was a way of combining the spiritual framework of spiritualism with the practical fear of premature burial. Here's a quirky detail. Some spiritualists developed elaborate theories about how premature burial might affect spiritual development. They theorized that a person who died while buried alive might be in a particularly troubled spiritual state, unable to rest, forced to wander the earth as a ghost. The premature burial fear became not just a medical or psychological concern, but a spiritual one. A spiritualist might support the exhumation of a coffin not necessarily because they believed the person was alive, but because they believed the person's spirit needed to be free from the coffin in order to achieve spiritual peace. The connection between spiritualism and premature burial fear also worked in the reverse direction. People who were anxious about premature burial might turn to spiritualism as a way of coping with their anxiety. If they could contact their deceased relatives through a medium, they could ask them directly whether they had been alive when buried. They could receive reassurance from the spirit that they had not, in fact, been premature buried. Or if they had, the spirit could explain what happened and provide closure. spiritualism offered a way to address the premature burial fear that bypassed the need for medical certainty. Some spiritualist mediums also made claims about being able to sense whether someone had been buried alive. They might claim to feel the spiritual presence of someone trapped in a grave, or to receive messages from such a spirit. These claims would be taken seriously by people interested in spiritualism and might lead to exhumations. The spiritualist medium was offering another form of death diagnosis, not based on medical knowledge, but on spiritual knowledge. For people who are skeptical of doctors, the spiritual diagnosis might seem more trustworthy. The spiritualist connection to premature burial also reflected class anxieties. Spiritualism was particularly popular among educated middle-class people who were anxious about aspects of their lives and their mortality. These were people who could afford to be anxious about premature burial, who had the time and money to explore spiritualism, who had access to spiritualist mediums and seances. The intersection of spiritualism and premature burial fear was an upper-middle-class phenomenon. Some spiritualists also took an interest in recording and documenting supposedly true cases of premature burial, the way spiritualist enthusiasts would document cases of supposed supernatural phenomena. They would compile accounts, try to verify them, write about them. The documentation they produced was similar in form to the documentation that newspapers produced, but motivated by spiritualist interest rather than sensationalism. The spiritualist accounts added another layer to the cultural narrative about premature burial. By the early 20th century, spiritualism was beginning to be discredited by scientific skepticism, and the connection between spiritualism and premature burial fear began to fade. But during the peak of the panic, spiritualism provided one way that people could address their fear, by attempting to communicate with the dead to ask whether they had experienced the horror the living so feared. It was an irrational response to a fear that was itself rooted in rational uncertainty, but it was the response that made sense within a spiritualist worldview. Historians still argue about how significant spiritualism's role was in maintaining or intensifying the premature burial panic. What's clear is that the two phenomena intersected in interesting ways, and that spiritualism provided some people with a framework for understanding and responding to their fears about premature burial. Insurance and legal complications, how fear of live burial affected death certificates and policy payouts, reveals another dimension of how the premature burial panic influenced practical affairs beyond just individual anxiety. Life insurance policies were becoming more common in the 19th century, as more Americans had access to insurance products. But life insurance created a problem. If someone had been buried but might still be alive, was a claim valid? Could you pay out the policy if you weren't absolutely certain the person was dead? Insurance companies became very interested in the premature burial question because there was significant financial motivation for them to get the answer right. If they paid out a policy on someone who was actually still alive, they would be liable. If they refused to pay on someone who was definitely dead because they feared premature burial, they would be exposing themselves to lawsuits. The uncertainty created practical legal and financial problems that couldn't be easily resolved. Some insurance companies developed elaborate requirements for death verification before they would pay out policies. A death certificate from a doctor wasn't necessarily enough. Some companies demanded additional verification, multiple witness affidavits, or even exhumation and examination of the body. The requirements were expensive and time-consuming, but from the insurance company's perspective, they were necessary to protect against the risk of paying out claims on people who were actually still alive. This created a perverse incentive structure. The more anxious people were about premature burial, the more insurance companies would demand additional verification, which would further fuel the anxiety. A widow needing the life insurance payout to pay for her deceased husband's funeral would find herself facing additional delays and expenses because the insurance company wanted to verify that the person was definitely dead before paying. The insurance company's protective measures would seem, to the widow, like confirmation that premature burial was a real threat. Otherwise, why would the company require all this extra verification? Here's a quirky detail. Some states began to pass laws specifically addressing the legal status of someone who might have been buried alive. These laws attempted to provide clarity about whether a person could be declared dead if they'd been buried, whether their estate could be settled, whether their surviving spouse could remarry. The laws were created because the premature burial fear had created genuine legal ambiguity. A person who had been buried and was legally declared dead might theoretically still be alive underground. What was the legal status of their estate, their marriage, their property? The laws tried to answer these questions, but the very fact that the laws were needed revealed how deeply the fear of premature burial had penetrated the legal and financial systems. The legal complications also created incentives for disputes. A relative who had a financial motive to have someone declared definitely dead might push for rapid settlement of the estate. Another relative might argue that more time was needed to verify that the person was truly dead before settling the estate. Insurance disputes could drag on for months or years because of the unresolved question of whether the person was definitely dead or possibly still alive. Some insurance companies also began offering special insurance products specifically aimed at protecting against premature burial. For a small additional fee, you could get a rider on your life insurance policy that would cover the costs of additional death verification procedures. The insurance company would cover the expense of exhumation and autopsy if needed. This rider, from the company's perspective, was a way to manage the risk. From the customer's perspective, it was a way to pay extra money to address their anxiety about premature burial. Death certificates themselves became more complicated because of the premature burial fear. A doctor filling out a death certificate had to be absolutely certain that the person was dead. If there was any doubt, the doctor might be reluctant to sign the certificate. The reluctance created delays. Families couldn't settle estates or receive insurance payouts until a death certificate was issued. The reluctance, born from the doctor's own anxiety about premature burial, would delay practical matters and cause additional distress. Some progressive jurisdictions began to standardize death certificate procedures and require doctors to verify death using specific diagnostic methods. The goal was to reduce the uncertainty and provide a more objective method for confirming death. But these standardized procedures themselves reflected the cultural anxiety about premature burial. There wouldn't have been a push to standardize procedures if the uncertainty hadn't been seen as a significant problem. The legal and financial complications also meant that the premature burial panic wasn't just an individual anxiety issue. It was something that affected institutions, laws, and economic arrangements. The panic had consequences for insurance companies, for estates, for inheritance law. These institutional effects helped keep the anxiety alive, because the institutions themselves had incentives to take the risk seriously. Historians still argue about whether the insurance industry's response to premature burial anxiety was a reasonable precaution, or whether it amplified anxiety unnecessarily. What's clear is that the fear of live burial created genuine legal and financial complications that went far beyond individual psychology and entered into the realm of law and commerce. The decline of the panic, why the early 1900s saw the fear gradually fade away, marks a shift in how Americans understood death, medical certainty, and their own relationship to mortality. The premature burial panic, which had gripped the nation through much of the 19th century, began to noticeably decline in the 1890s and had largely faded by the 1920s. The decline wasn't sudden. There was no single moment when everyone stopped being afraid of premature burial. Rather, it was a gradual erosion of belief in the threat, driven by multiple factors working together. One major factor was the growing certainty of medical knowledge. As the 19th century progressed into the 20th, medical science became more sophisticated and more credible. Doctors developed better diagnostic tools and methods. The confusion about death diagnosis didn't completely disappear, but it diminished. When a modern doctor said someone was dead, people were more likely to believe them, because the medical profession had earned greater credibility through its other achievements. The gap between what doctors said and what the public believed began to narrow. Another factor was the shift in funeral practices. Embalming became increasingly standard, and embalmed bodies didn't produce the sounds and phenomena that had seemed to suggest live burial. The shift away from home funerals to funeral parlours meant that the body was handled by professionals rather than family members, which seemed to provide additional reassurance. The increasing professionalisation of death care meant that there were professional protocols and procedures. If the funeral director said the person was dead and properly handled, that seemed like it should be sufficient assurance. The decline also reflected a generational shift. The people who had lived through the peak of the panic, who had been adults during the 1870s and 1880s when the fear was at its height, gradually aged and died. Their children, born later and raised in an era when the panic was already beginning to fade, didn't carry the same deep anxiety about premature burial. The cultural panic gradually declined as the generation that had experienced it most intensely passed away, and was replaced by a generation that saw it as a relic of superstition. Here's a quirky detail. Spiritualism, which had been popular during the peak of the premature burial panic, was increasingly discredited and dismissed in the early 20th century. As spiritualism declined, one of the frameworks that had allowed people to address their premature burial anxiety also disappeared. People who had dealt with their anxiety through spiritualist seances lost that outlet. But by then, the underlying anxiety was also fading, so the loss of spiritualism didn't create a new crisis. The development of new medical technologies and understanding also contributed to the decline. The discovery of X-rays and other diagnostic tools suggested that death could be verified in new ways. The growing understanding of the nervous system and the brain suggested that death was more definitive than people had previously believed. If consciousness required an intact brain and functioning nervous system, and if the nervous system shut down at death, then someone definitely couldn't be conscious while buried, because consciousness couldn't exist without a functioning brain. The improvement in transportation and communication also meant that extreme cases of medical misdiagnosis were less likely. A person who seemed dead but wasn't could potentially be revived if someone noticed the error quickly. With better transportation and communication, errors could be caught faster. The improvements in technology didn't necessarily make premature burial impossible, but they made it seem less likely and less catastrophic if it did happen. The newspaper coverage of premature burial also changed. By the early 20th century, sensational stories about live burials were less common in newspapers. The stories that had driven the panic were no longer being told as frequently. The media moved on to other sensational topics. The absence of the stories meant that new people entering adulthood weren't being exposed to the narrative of premature burial panic that had shaped their parents' generation. Some specific historical events also contributed to the decline. The development of the telephone network, which was more sophisticated than the telegraph, allowed for better real-time communication and verification of information. The rise of professional journalism standards, though gradual and incomplete, meant that newspapers were more likely to verify stories before publishing them. The growth of professional medical organizations and medical journals meant that scientific findings were more likely to be widely shared among doctors. Educational improvements also played a role. As education became more widespread and literacy increased, more people had access to scientific information. They could read medical journals or books about decomposition and understand what was actually happening to bodies underground. The scientific literacy of the population increased, which meant that the population was less likely to believe purely superstitious explanations of phenomena. The economic shifts of the early 20th century also contributed. As the economy shifted toward industrial and commercial concerns, the cultural preoccupation with death and mourning that had characterized Victorian culture began to fade. The elaborate mourning rituals that had been standard in the 19th century were simplified. The cultural focus shifted away from death and toward progress and the future. The premature burial panic was a 19th century preoccupation, and as the century ended it began to fade. Historians still argue about which of these factors was most important in the decline of the panic. The most likely answer is that all of them played a role, working together to gradually shift how Americans understood and thought about death and medical certainty. The panic didn't disappear instantly because it was driven by multiple causes, but as all those causes gradually shifted, the panic lost its power over the cultural imagination. The legacy that lingers, how 1800s coffin anxiety still haunts modern death rituals in our psyche, shows that even though the premature burial panic is no longer an active cultural force, its traces remain embedded in how we think about death, how we handle bodies, and what we fear about mortality. The anxiety of the 19th century didn't completely disappear when the 20th century began. It transformed, faded, but never entirely vanished. Some of our modern death rituals actually trace their origin to the premature burial panic. The funeral viewing, where family and friends see the body one last time before burial, has roots in the Victorian practice of verifying that the person was definitely dead. While the modern viewing serves multiple psychological purposes, it originated partially from the anxiety that seeing the body would confirm death. Embalming, which became standard practice in America and influenced funeral practices in other countries, was partly justified as a way of definitively preserving the body and preventing the phenomena that supposedly indicated premature burial. The psychological legacy of the panic also persists. People living today inherit, culturally if not genetically, the anxiety about death that the 19th century panic expressed. The modern fear of being buried alive might be less culturally pervasive than it was in the 1870s, but it hasn't disappeared. People still have nightmares about being trapped in coffins. People still worry about being mistaken for dead. The anxiety has been transformed into modern forms. Fear of being declared brain dead and having life support removed. Fear of comas being misunderstood as death. But the underlying anxiety about being confused with death while still alive persists. Modern horror fiction and entertainment still regularly mines the premature burial anxiety for scares. Stories about people waking up in coffins are genuinely frightening to modern audiences, even though the probability of premature burial in the modern era is vanishingly small. The anxiety is so deeply rooted in our cultural consciousness that it persists even when the rational justification for it has largely disappeared. A person watching a movie about someone waking up in a coffin will experience genuine fear, even though they know, rationally, that premature burial is extremely unlikely. Here's a quirky detail. Some modern life insurance policies still include requirements for death verification, tracing their origin directly to the insurance complications that arose from the 19th century panic. The insurance industry's response to the panic created institutional practices that persisted long after the panic itself had faded. Even now, insurance companies demand evidence of death before paying out policies, a requirement that originated in the anxiety of the 19th century. Modern medical technology has made premature burial essentially impossible. Brain scans, EKGs, blood tests, sophisticated physical examinations all make it virtually inconceivable that a living person would be pronounced dead in a modern hospital. Yet the anxiety persists, because psychological anxieties aren't always based on rational assessment of actual risk. The anxiety about being confused with death has been replaced by other anxieties about being in a permanent vegetative state, about being unable to communicate consciousness, about losing bodily autonomy. But the core fear remains. Some people today refuse organ donation because of anxiety that was likely inherited, culturally if not directly, from the 19th century premature burial panic. They fear that declaring them dead would be a false declaration, that organs would be removed while they were still alive, that they would wake up on the operating table. The anxiety is small enough that most people don't let it prevent them from donating organs, but it exists. It's a legacy of the 19th century fear. The cultural emphasis on cremation has risen significantly in the modern era, and some historians argue that the decline in belief in premature burial contributed to the shift away from traditional burial. If you cremate a body, the question of whether the person might have been alive becomes moot. Decomposition becomes instantaneous and complete. The shift toward cremation, while motivated by multiple factors, may partly reflect the lingering anxiety about burial. The end-of-life care debates in modern medicine also echo the anxiety of the 19th century. When we debate whether someone in a coma or vegetative state should have life support removed, we're grappling with the same fundamental question. How do we know for certain that someone is dead? How do we distinguish between loss of consciousness and death? The specific technology and context are different, but the underlying anxiety is the same. Some modern horror and suspense stories also continue to use the premature burial scenario as a vehicle for exploring anxiety about loss of bodily autonomy and control. Being trapped, unable to move or communicate, conscious but unable to signal consciousness, these remain deeply frightening scenarios. The anxiety about premature burial transformed into anxiety about being trapped in other ways, in hospitals, in nursing homes, in our own bodies. The fear evolves, but it doesn't disappear. The 19th century premature burial panic is a perfect historical example of how anxiety can spread through a culture, become self-sustaining through media and repetition, and persist even after the rational basis for it has largely disappeared. It shows how fear can drive technology and industry, how uncertainty can generate panic, and how a cultural anxiety can become embedded in institutions and practices. The legacy of that panic persists in modern funeral practices, in modern anxieties about death and medical authority, in our entertainment, and in our collective psychological relationship to death and dying. The room around you is quiet now. The story you've been listening to, the account of how a nation gripped itself in fear in the darkness of the 19th century, asking whether the people they loved might wake up screaming in wooden boxes beneath the earth. That story is fading now, like the echo of those terrified voices growing quieter and quieter, more and more distant. You're warm in the darkness. The fear that gripped generations of Americans in the 1800s, the fear of scratching sounds from coffins, of bells that might ring too quietly to be heard, of bodies that might wake up too late in sealed chambers deep underground. That fear belongs to the past now. It belongs to people who lived in different times, with different technology, with less certain medicine. It belongs to the distant past where it cannot touch you. The coffins of the 1800s are all long since decayed into soil now. The bells installed by anxious families have gone silent. The safety mechanisms designed to prevent impossible horrors have rusted away. The people who feared so desperately are gone. Their anxiety dissolved like the wood of their elaborate coffins. You are safe here, in the warm dark, in the present time where medical science is sophisticated, where death is understood, where the terrors of uncertainty that haunted the 19th century have been largely addressed. Your breath is steady. Your heart beats steadily in your chest, carrying blood and life through your body, reminding you that you are alive, that you are here, that the anxiety of the buried is not your anxiety. The scratching sounds from coffins were not really scratching sounds from people trying to escape. They were decomposition, they were gas, they were the natural sounds of bodies returning to soil. The fear was real, but the threat was imaginary. The panic that gripped a nation was born from uncertainty and darkness, and the human mind's tendency to imagine the worst when faced with the unknown. And now, as you drift deeper into sleep as the comfort of your bed supports you, you can let that fear go. You can let the anxiety of the 19th century belong to the 19th century, where it originated, where it lived, where it has now faded into history. You are safe. The night is quiet. Sleep is coming.